is 10 o'clock, and it is the 21st of April, and I'd like to welcome everybody. Oh, wait till we do hugs. I don't have my gavel on, so I can really make noise here. All right, we'll call this meeting to order. Welcome, everybody. This is the April 21st, 2017 meeting of the California Road Charge Pilot Technical Advisory Committee. I want to welcome all of you here today, and let us begin with a roll call, and I'll call on Ann to call the roll. Is your microphone on, Ann? I don't think it is. There's a button somewhere there.
Mary Benzel? Here. Senator Jim Bell? Lee Tidd? Lisa Bartlett?
Here.
Lauren Kay? Here. Martin Wax?
Here.
Liddy Culver? Here. Pam O'Connor? Richard Marcantonio? Here. Robert Poitras?
Here.
Steve Finnegan?
Here.
Chair Jim Medapper?
Here. Wonderful. Well, wow. We have a great attendance. Thank you all to the members of the Technical Advisory Committee for being here today in sunny Sacramento. And we've got a lot to cover today, and we'll kind of go over a number of things. But before we get started on that, let's go to see if we have any public comment, which is item 2 on our agenda. Are there any members of the public that would like to address the Technical Advisory Committee? Well, seeing none, we'll continue that during the meeting. Let's go to item 3 on the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes from December 9th.
Move approval.
We have a motion for approval of the minutes. Is there any discussion on that? Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion from Finnegan, second from Sauer for approving the minutes. Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, our minutes are approved. I want to turn it over to item 4 on the agenda to introduce Curtis Vandermolen, who is new at the California Transportation Commission. He's a deputy director. And I'll let Curtis tell you a little bit about his background, but he understands politics, and he understands the fact that the gas tax is not a good thing long term. And I think he can share with you some of his background on that. And we welcome him to CTC, and we welcome him to this effort here as basically staff to the Technical Advisory Committee for the Commission. Curtis?
Good morning, Mr. Medapper, Chair Medapper, and members of the TAC. I'm Curtis Vandermolen. I'm Deputy Director for Road Charge at the California Transportation Commission. I was more recently working with the State Assembly doing policy analysis and giving advice on the movement of bills and other things through the State Assembly, motions and just general help with policy and political issues there. I came over here, my first report that I wrote on road charge was in early 2010, and I identified it then as a necessary step in providing a equitable and forward-looking way to preserve road funding. And when this opportunity came open for me to step over and help you all with it, it was really a natural fit for me and something that I very much wanted to do, to come in and help move that ball forward.
So here's a guy that in 2010 wrote the report on this thing for legislation that didn't even get signed to authorize what we're doing until 2014. That's
correct. So on item number 4, it's the review of the December action items. Caltrans CFO, Norma Ortega, has given you a memorandum addressing those points from the action items left over from the December meeting. If there's any questions on that, happy to take those questions.
So do we have any questions on that, or do you want to go over any of the issues?
Sure, I can briefly go through it.
Yeah, if you would, that would be good, just in case everybody.
So the first question was, how many calls to customer support call centers were problems versus inquiries? And this was something that we put off for a little while because we wanted to make sure that we got kind of a whole pilot look at this. And most of the calls that came into The call centers, as you can see on table 1, were just general questions about it, whether it's, how do I plug it in, or where in my car do I plug it in, or, how do I pick an account manager? Can you help me with that? A lot of these were inquiries as far as, what is road charge? How is this going to work? And not necessarily in the problem category of, hey, I have an issue like my app stopped working, or I plugged it in and I can't get it connected. You look at those things as problems. Mid-pilot, the participants were offered an opportunity to change account managers or change their report manager.
I'm sorry,
yes,
Curtis, just one, I don't know if it's a question or just a brief comment. And obviously this is a pilot and it's not completely widespread implementation. But it seems like if with a pilot of about 5,000 participants and 1,000 of them reporting some sort of a problem, that seems high. And I don't know how that compares to Oregon or other states, or if there are any thoughts on that. And if there are, great. If not, just a sort of a comment that it seems like a high number.
Right. I think you'll see as we go through the presentation later, there's some charts that'll be presented by D'Artagnan, which show at the very beginning of the pilot, call volumes were extremely high because people were just getting into this and trying to figure it out, and trying to figure out their account manager and whether they were plugging it in or how they were supposed to take the picture with their cell phone if they were using that method. So we had very, very high call volumes at the beginning, and it very quickly dropped off to much more simplistic and manageable level. The next question was, why did people change account managers or reporting methods in open enrollment? Participants were given the option to do one, the other, or both of those. There were very few people who chose to make one of those changes, and particularly coming from our focus groups and from the surveys, a lot of people chose to do it because they wanted to try something else. This was a pilot project and they wanted to get experience with the different methods. There were a few that we heard of that had a problem with one of the reporting methods. For instance, one individual was using the cell phone take a picture method, and his car was in an accident and he couldn't get it connected on the new car. So he decided to go with a different method for that newer car. Any questions or other details on that? Okay. Analyzing the composition of the pilot participants versus the general population. Again, as we go through these presentations today from D'Artagnan and CH2M, we did our best in the short presentations to tease out some of these groups and give you some more demographic data on it to make sure that we're looking at all these different segments of economic and social equity. In this case, we've got a number of charts here that talk about the participant volumes by region, by urban versus rural designation, household incomes, ages, genders, and race or ethnicity identification. And those will again come up in some later slides through the presentations as we look at whether participants were satisfied with the pilot, how they felt about the fairness of the pilot, or the fairness of the gas tax versus road charge, and some other issues that came up. And the last question there was, what margin of error is there when we have small sample sizes in the survey? The pilot program was so far the largest in the nation by a huge amount. 5,000 participants is a very large sample size, and I think the technical advisory committee did very well to recommend that in all the groups that you recommended. And you've got a chart here that shows the different margins of error based on the different surveys that went out. From a very low 0.7 all the way up to, in the open enrollment period, because there was a very small number that actually took advantage of it, you've got a higher margin of error there.
Very good. Any questions for Curtis? Richard, you're trying to figure out the mics. There's buttons that you can see. There's the red, a yellow, and a green, and then keep going up and you'll see the microphone.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. As a non-statistician, Curtis, I wonder if you can either now or later provide, I'm looking at the helpful breakouts by demographic group, and there are some that clearly didn't meet our initial goals. 8% Latinos, small number of women relative to men, small number of below median to above median income, and so on. And I'm just wondering, in terms of those subcategories and then some of the overlaps of those, what's our confidence in terms of statistical significance?
Is that something, Travis, you'll get to in your report?
We'll get to that.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that'll probably, as we're still working on numbers, that'll end up having to be an introductory to our next session in March or in May. This one, we're giving you as much of the preliminary data as we can, and then in May we'll do just kind of a brief overview to hit those fine points, and hopefully launch you into some really deep policy discussions on the impacts of what that data means.
Okay.
Could I ask a question, Jim?
Yeah, please.
I'm wondering, it says here margin of error. I wonder if now and in the future, when we talk about margins of error, you can define what specifically that means. Is it that the mean of the sample size, just because that can be interpreted to mean different things if you can be precise about what it means in the context it's
You'd like the
provided.
information on how that margin of error was reached?
Well, what it represents.
Okay.
When you get a scientist asking these questions, they need the specifics. That's the beauty of this committee, is you've got a variety of experts. So thank you. And anything else on item 4? Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay, let's go to item 5 on the agenda, which is reports from Technical Advisory Committee members. And while we're doing that, we will welcome Councilmember Pam O'Connor from Santa Monica, member of the TAC, to the dais. Welcome, Pam, and thank you for being here. And again, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate, we have everybody but one member of the TAC is present today. So that's an outstanding representation. So let's go to item 5. And on item 5 is really TAC member reports. This is where each of you can kind of share with us things that have been going on relative to road charge since we last met in Riverside. And why don't I turn it to Nidhi first?
Thank you. I have a question, or I received a question from a pilot member who's also at an academic / research institution, asking if there's some way in which the data from this pilot can be made available for academic study, and I was hoping you could advise on that.
So I knew Nidhi was going to ask the question. I saw it in statute that it is allowed for academic purposes, but, devoid of all personal identifiable information. So I don't know if that's something we'd turn to Carrie to report back on at some point, perhaps for our May meeting, or get back to Nidhi between now and then so she could respond.
Definitely, I will do that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Any other questions, comments? Mr. Sauer.
We had, keeping with tradition, as we've done throughout the entire pilot, we've been updating our members at our board and executive committee meetings, and we had Norma come to our annual membership conference and brief our highway policy committee and provide an update. So thank you, Norma, for making the trek to Monterey.
Terry?
I just wanted to comment on the use of data and academics. My team at University of Southern California Information Sciences Institute has a long history of doing data anonymization, cleaning, partial anonymization, particularly relevant to PII. And so, we might be able to provide some advisory or review of any processes. And of course, we share lots of big data, through academic partnerships.
Any other members? Supervisor?
So now that we're through with the pilot program, a number of my constituents have sort of reported back. They were really favorable about the pilot program. Most of them used the technology-based solutions. One had one where they would take the photograph of their odometer and then go to the station. But I think I had a really favorable response. Their comments ranged from, well, if this is going to be something down the road as a true replacement for the gas tax, when is it going to be implemented? How are we going to transition over to it? What does it mean, not going to the gas pump to pay our excise tax there? So I think that people are, the the residents are interested in wanting a good solution for the long term. I think more of the challenges lie perhaps on the legislative side of things and making sure that we make progress on a bipartisan basis with our legislators that, we truly need to have a true replacement for the gas tax. So is this an appropriate time to talk about the passage of SB 1?
Absolutely. That's what I was going to kick into, and I think we can use this item on our agenda as more of a roundtable of the Technical Advisory Committee, so please.
Okay, so with the passage now of SB 1 that barely squeaked through, it does provide, it's anticipated to provide about $52 billion over the next 10 years for transportation infrastructure. And I think a lot of us have some very real concerns about the amount of revenue that's actually going to be generated, because when you take a look at the population of people filling up at the gas pump, that population is dropping month after month, year after year, because we have more fuel-efficient vehicles. They're getting, more miles to the gallon. They're not filling up as often. We have a lot more in the way of all natural gas vehicles and all electric vehicles that are coming online. And as prices start to drop in the purchase price for these vehicles that are fuel-efficient and meet the air quality standards, they're not going to the gas pump at all. So we've got this decreasing population of people that are paying the gas excise tax. And a lot of the concerns have to do with the 12-cent increase, that's not sustainable based on the expected revenue stream at the state level. And so even though we have the economic inflators assigned to the gas excise tax, right now we've got a 12-cent increase to keep up with the level of funding that the state is requiring or anticipating. It'll have to go from 12 cents to 15 cents to 18 cents to a point where it's really not sustainable. And you're basically taxing a smaller and smaller market out there. And a lot of those individuals are those who can least afford it. They're traveling from places like Riverside and San Bernardino into Orange County, for instance, to work. And they've got the older gas guzzler vehicles, so they are filling up more at the pump. So it's really not fair to that population. And then when you take a look at the registration fees that are being, the additional fees that are being charged, you're talking about $175 fee, so additional fee. So if you've got an all-electric Tesla, for instance, you might have two drivers out there. One Tesla driver is now saved up all his life, and now he's so excited he bought his all-electric Tesla, but he's retired and he's going to drive 5,000 miles a year. Well, he's paying the $175 additional fee. You have another Tesla driver, and he's a salesperson still active in the workforce, but he's driving 58,000 miles a year. He's paying the $175 fee. So there's a lot of inequity, a lot of imbalance with what's being put through at this point, and I think we're going to have to be realistic and educate our legislators and the government in Sacramento about what we're going to do to create a fair program for people that are utilizing the road, so that we don't just increase the gas prices to the point where people will use other alternative methods for transportation and no longer go to the gas pump at all. So I think those are some of the things that are being brought up at the local level and certainly the regional levels, and we've got to somehow get the message clearly stated in Sacramento with the legislators and the governor's office that we have to have a different way of thinking. We need to start it sooner versus later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. And I think your comments are a good segue. And I know some of us will probably have a few things to say on this. And I guess I'll kind of add on to it as well. I mean, the road charge pilot officially ended the end of last month, March 31st. And, this 9 months of study with 5,000 vehicles.
It just seems like 9,000 months.
It does seem like 9,000 months. There's no doubt about that. As Curtis mentioned, with California having done this test, we are the biggest pilot that has taken place. There's a ton of data that's come in and a lot of ideas as to what we do next. And Senate Bill 1, and I congratulate the governor and the legislature for passing Senate Bill 1. It was definitely nothing that was easy. Clearly it was done on partisan lines, and there's still going to be a lot of scar tissue for some time to come on that. But as emotions calm and as we move forward, recognizing that roads are not a partisan thing. Pothole affects Democrats and Republicans. Taking care of our transportation infrastructure is something that we all know we've neglected for a variety of reasons. At least Senate Bill 1 gives us some breathing room. But it is not a panacea. It is not going to solve a $300 billion backlog that this state has. I don't want to diminish the notion of $52 billion. That's a lot of money. But we have a $300 billion backlog. So I'm not sitting here saying we need to raise more money, because I'm not saying that. But I just want to put it into context. But I think what I am saying is this. There is no doubt the gasoline tax is probably the least understood and the most unpopular tax in the state of California, probably the United States. And so we really need to look to the future as to what we can do to create a fair program to pay for our transportation. An equitable program, a program that's sensitive to environmental justice issues, a program that's sensitive to the needs of our infrastructure. And we need to take what we've been doing here now to the next level. We need to be looking at what can we be doing that's better. We piloted something that had several models that our consultants recommended, and you all have heard me ad nauseum saying I think the easiest thing, at least if you're driving a gasoline-powered car, is to pull up to a pump, your miles get transmitted into the pump, and off you drive, and you still do what you're doing today. You put 20 bucks on number 10, and you fill up, and off you go. That's why people don't even know they're paying the gas. I mean, they know they're paying it, but they don't even know. They just pay it because it's part of the price, and off they go. I think the only way you're ever going to see a mileage charge work is if it's as simple as that for the public. They don't want extra stuff. They don't want to deal with new accounts. But maybe we should be thinking about the future. We've got Uber, we've got Lyft, we've got public transportation. We've got things that we're already paying for now out of a pot of money. Maybe eventually that could be a method to which we pay for our miles. And there's no question, it's equity. People get the fact that you pay for what you use. The more you drive, the more you pay. People right now that are low income, that are driving a truck that gets 10 miles to the gallon and drive 100 miles to work, are paying a heck of a lot more than the person in the Prius driving 100 miles to get to work. The person in the Prius is probably paying less than a penny and a half a mile in gas tax. The low-income individual driving a 10-mile-an-hour vehicle, 100 miles to get to work, is probably paying 10 cents a mile. There's not equity there in the gas tax. Again, these are the kind of things that as we look at those issues, and then we embrace the technology that we know is coming. And you've heard me say this, that we've got a sea change in transportation unlike anything since Henry Ford invented the assembly line. I like saying that because it puts into context where we're moving. And as we see autonomous vehicles, these manufacturers working in secret to race to be first to market, we're going to see a big change over the next 5 to 10 years. So SB 1 gives us some breathing room, but it doesn't mean we should stop here. It means that we need to keep going and continue to refine what we've started and make it better. Make it good for the consumer, blend it with the technology we know that's coming, and make it fair and equitable. And so that's kind of my overarching thesis statement, and we're taking input from members of the legislature. We want to hear from each of you, and I'd love to get all of your comments. I'm kind of giving you a precursor to what we're going to talk about in May in San Diego is going to be a real brainstorming session. So today we'll do a data dump. We'll give you a lot of information. But when we get to San Diego, we want you to come with ideas. And if you can't make it to the May meeting, I want to figure out a way we can get you via Skype or Zoom or something so we can make sure you're all participatory. And then as you look to the other meetings we have coming up for 2017, you should all have the schedule in front of you. And I just want to touch on that before I turn the mic over to my colleague and Vice Chair Steve Finnegan. But you look at San Diego, May 19th. We're in Chico on July 21st. We don't know where we are, September 15th. So we're open for ideas. And then we'll be at the Mission Inn in Riverside on December 8th. So that's our schedule. I will say this, we'll hear more from Carrie, we'll hear more from our staff, but legislatively, the TAC is in business through the end of 18. We accelerated things for a variety of reasons on the pilot, and I think it's really working out well because it's going to give us some breathing room. So between now and probably this next legislative session, I'll say by the end of this year, really by October, November, I'd like to have this technical advisory committee, and well before then, have recommendations, because I think you all know that, in the next couple of months, Secretary Brian Kelly and Secretary of Transportation for the state will be submitting a report pursuant to Senate Bill 1077. And then the California Transportation Commission will be writing a report as well. And I expect the state's report to really give us a data dump on what's happened and maybe some ideas going forward. But it's really up to the CTC and this technical advisory committee to give the legislature recommendations on what we should be doing next. So whether it's the Richard Marcantonio issues that we have to be sensitive to, or Nitty on the science, or Terry on academics, or Eric on trucking, and all of our other issues in between, these are issues that make this TAC work. And so I just wanted to give you kind of a context of what we've got. A lot of work to do. It's anything but done. It's really just beginning. And so with that, let me turn it over to Stephen and then see if I can engender any other members of the TAC. Again, I'm doing this under 5 because it's reports and you're reporting your thoughts. Steve?
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. And I see a lot of hands out on the microphone button, so I know there's a lot of desire to comment, and which is awesome, which is why this committee has been such fun to work with and such an important issue. I wanted to touch on a couple of things that have been said so far briefly, and then maybe touch on a couple of others. And I am looking forward to the May meeting. I think that's an excellent idea to focus the May meeting on what comes next. What beyond the numbers that we're getting out of the pilot experience, what do we need to take to the legislature, to agency, and to others, and to the public, frankly? What are the big policy issues? What are we grappling with? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? What are the views of everybody? Because I think that has to get into these reports and into these recommendations some way. Touch on a couple points that were made. One, fairness. I think that is such a fundamentally critical issue, and obviously, and everyone's definition of fairness may be different, and it depends on what you look at. But I think that gets to how much is charged, how it's charged, what are the variables based on that, how does it impact people. It even gets to how the money's used. I think that these are big policy issues that need to be addressed. Simplicity, and with simplicity is also cost. The cost to implement these programs, and I think that needs to be thought through and looked at in relation to, as Supervisor Bartlett mentioned, the long-term decline of the gas tax, and so I know we'll see a chart in today that has lines crossing, but when do those lines really cross from a revenue standpoint versus a cost standpoint, comparing the gasoline tax to other things? I would want to note also that the Auto Club AAA participated as a commercial participant in this effort, and we had a number of our claims vehicles participating, and from everything I heard, things went well. They enjoyed participating, and that worked well for them. I had a quick question, maybe for Norma or somebody else. What is the recommendation? I'm forgetting now, from the Board of Equalization on the gas tax increase for July?
The question is what? Sorry.
The Board of Equalizations, the annual adjustment process, which I know will go away at some point in the future, but for this year,
The sales tax portion.
the sales tax portion on the gasoline, what's that increase?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but we do
Mike.
expect it to go up.
Sit up above you, more higher. There you go.
There you go. I don't have the number memorized, but it is expected to go up.
Right.
And we forecasted that number as part of our fund estimate that we'll be doing and updating. We'll have numbers in June for the commission.
Okay, great. And I guess my point is, there is the 12-cent increase in SB1. There is the expected increase this year from the Board of Equalization. There is the indexing that's included in there as well. And I think, frankly, the 12-cent increase, there was a sort of built into SB1, I think was a real 7.5-cent increase, which is sort of an anticipation of where those numbers were going to go. So it was really a 19.5-cent gas tax increase. So that is a lot of money, and and certainly there's a need for it. In addition, the annual charges that were mentioned as well, they may not, fairness is a very legitimate issue that needs to be talked about with that, but I think that that's on top of all of this as well. So I think SB1, if nothing else, provides some breathing room on this issue, which I think, frankly, is a good thing. I think that, as I've said before, I think the public has no idea these discussions are going on. The public clearly in the research that this effort looked at doesn't know how things are paid for. And I think that we need to just work through with the public, with the legislature and others to move forward in a way that makes sense. And we'll have more discussions on that in May. And I look forward to hearing both today and in May people's thoughts and recommendations, because I think this committee needs to give some of those, even though we're a technical advisory committee, I think we need to give some of those policy thoughts and policy recommendations, and even if there are different opinions on that, but that needs to be part of the effort going forward. So I'll stop there.
Well, I agree. I think that it's incumbent that the commission certainly give some policy recommendations, and I love hearing what this committee has to say as part of that. I think it's important. Who else? Professor Wax.
I'd like to request that at the meeting which was just mentioned, at which we'll be brainstorming, that we get some data on revenue forecasts as a result of the changes in the gas tax structure. The three people now, Supervisor Bartlett, Steve Finnegan, and our chairman, Madaffer, have mentioned that that the gasoline tax is not sustainable in the long term, and at some point you said the lines will cross. Steve, the point is that there are quantitative estimates of that available, and we should have them before us as we deliberate. My understanding, I've done some of these forecasts, is that the biggest determinant of revenue is actually the pump price of fuel, which is driven largely by the price of petroleum and not by the tax on it, and that right now actually revenue from the gas tax is increasing because people are buying larger cars again because the price of gasoline has gone down. But it's very volatile, and the way we should look at it is, if the price is high, then this might happen. If the price is low, then this might happen, and we can't predict what the price will actually be 5 to 10 years in the future. But having those revenue forecasts before us would I think, help us build an argument. Thank you.
So, Chairman Affer, we will, the administration will be releasing numbers based on the new revenue structure for May revise. So I believe that happens before the May meeting, so we would be able to share some of that information.
Okay. Supervisor Bartlett?
So two things. When you talk about the crossover point of the gas tax increase, the $52 billion over 10 years, and where that crossover point is, I think, as Chairman Daffer stated, we're already starting in a deficit position, because if they're going to try to raise $52 billion over the next 10 years, we're already $300 billion in arrears on fixing our roads and highways. So we're starting out in a deficit position. So just want to mention that. And then I would like to offer Orange County as a venue for the September 15th meeting.
That certainly makes it easy for travel. I like that. Nidhi, and then Terry.
Two quick comments. I was going to offer San Francisco as an option for our September meeting. Just throw that out there. And the other comment I have is, for some people who are paying attention to this committee and what's happening, they're going to have either concerns, they're kind of concerns about whether a road charge infrastructure will be used to implement things like congestion pricing or a carbon tax, and we've heard that in previous meetings and comments. And for some people, this is an opportunity to do those things if they want it, and for others, this is the thin edge of the wedge. And so I wonder if in May, those are within scope, those questions of how, what is the scope of this committee's work? What is the scope of the state's road charge tax? How will those other things be implemented? That might be something we should consider. And I lied, I have a third comment, which is for the May meeting, if we're going to talk about environment, social equity issues, it would be valuable to have information and data on, for example, what are the equity issues in transportation, maybe in general, or, I mean, for example, I anticipate a concern among some that even though this is a step towards equalizing transportation costs, it doesn't go far enough because still it will be flatly applied. It would be valuable to know what are the mechanisms for addressing that, whether it's, with EBT or something else. So I'm just putting an open request for information that may help us provide context for the discussions that we have in May.
Terry?
I think it's going to be very important for us to identify technology and security and privacy. And while technology is going to change and there are technology gaps between newer cars and older automobiles, coming from a technical university research laboratory, the orientation of everyone I talk to is this sort of first puzzle. Well, how will it work, right? And while for a pilot it's important for us to look at a variety of different areas, I think a really crisp statement of it will be done through either A, B, or C. Just keeping it really crisp and something that can say, if it's pay at the pump with cars with this kind of technology, it'll look like this. If it's self-reporting, it will look like this. If it's driving to a station to have it assessed, it'll look like this, right? And then for each one of those 3 technological approaches for getting the reporting done, then we can make a corresponding statement about how that impacts security and privacy. And I think it's going to be vital that we do that. And then finally, I think the fairness issue, while as we all understand, there still is a discrepancy between lower income driving longer distance in less fuel efficient cars. To me, the place that I find the argument most convincing is talking about the fairness of how this tax will now be applied to all of the electric vehicle drivers who are at this moment, evading the tax or, getting scoot free. And so I find that actually helps some of the lower income, sort of the one percenters argument over again, right? Aha, we found a way to, make sure that those at the upper end are paying their fair share. Still, the fact of life is that there still will be discrepancies, but this is very important. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Guess that's working. I think about the passage of SB1 and all that went into it, and at the very end, it came down to be a very partisan issue. And it, each of the legislators that voted yay or nay were thinking about whether or not they were going to get reelected the next term. And it came down to a vote from Senator Cannella that really didn't care because he was termed out. And it certainly would have been used against him. And it shouldn't be that way, but that's the practical situation that we face. So we can go through the theoretical exercise and craft something, but when it goes to the legislature, it's a whole different world. They're looking at it from, from a party standpoint, from, their lobbyists and so on and so forth. And if they're going to get kicked out of the Capitol and sent across to, a building or sent down to the basement. So, which has happened to legislators on one side of the aisle that happen to live in the San Joaquin Valley. It's happened quite a few times. So, so I think what it comes down, what I look at, and it's been mentioned, it can't be overemphasized, the need for a massive education effort. And I think that, again, in my part of the world, people just have no understanding about where road taxes come from. And I think an argument was for the increase per mile from 18 cents to 30 cents. I think it was a very poor presentation as far as the value of money, and all it was about, it's going to be an increase. And so people believe that money's being diverted, and there's a case to be made for that. People believe that money's being used inefficiently. And so I think there's probably a case for that also. And so that's why I think that SB1 barely passed. And if we want to see any success of moving forward with a mileage charge, which I think is a great way to go, again, it has to be, we have to kind of look at it from the partisan, from the political, from the legislative viewpoint, look at it from their, how they're going to view this thing, regardless of what the real world is, and again, just educate. So, thank you.
Any other comments?
Yes.
Richard.
Thank you. So first I want to say SB1 did not barely pass. SB1 passed by a supermajority, and this is a friendly opposing position that I'd like to get out there. We are a state which requires a 2/3 vote to increase taxes. But I think we all on this commission, on this advisory committee, recognize that our roads and our infrastructure and the other things that this bill is funding are public goods. They're necessary public goods. Maybe I shouldn't speak for everyone. Maybe others have a different view on this. But my view is that we do need to provide for public goods. Roads are an example of that. We can't each go out and build our own roads and to drive where we want to drive. And I think there's a critical role of government in providing and maintaining public goods. So that's number one. Number two is a request to pile on with others. I guess now we have a lot of data about by various sort of detailed segments of the population about how much people drove in the pilot, right? So I would love to see a chart that compares by demographic segment and subsegment what that segment paid on average, or sorry, would have paid under a road charge versus what it would pay under the new SB1 regime. And then related to that, I should say that we've talked a lot over the year plus of our deliberations about this being a revenue neutral road charge. And I've been, I think, in dissent on that point, partly because I didn't think revenue neutral was enough to get us there. Well, revenue neutral, I think, has now shifted. So I think that's something we should be thinking about. And I guess, honestly, I'm interested to know, what does revenue neutral per mile now look like? What is that calculation? And then just since we're putting on our futurist lenses, I'll just venture to say that I do think it's important for us to think about the future of transportation because it's changing very rapidly. And one part of that future that I think some folks are seeing is that with the advent of autonomous vehicles, private automobile ownership is going to become a rarer and rarer thing. And we're going to see the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world owning massive fleets. And so I'll just mention that in connection with funding and say that, A, what are they going to pay, and for their share of the road costs, but also B, how are we going to regulate that in the public interest as a utility, for instance?
Very good thoughts. Again, I love all of these different things. Any others for comments? On item 5 on our agenda? Okay, so we've got the schedule. We know where we're headed. Now let's delve into what was and what has happened as we get up to this point. And with that, let me turn it over to Carrie Porvahidi from Caltrans, Curtis from CTC on item 6 on our agenda to talk about status updates and our next steps.
Chairman Medaffer, I'm going to lead off on this, and frankly, you stole most of our thunder on this. Looking forward on where we are on putting reports together and what we're doing at the May TAC meeting. So I'll just very quickly reiterate that as far as the commission goes, this TAC meeting is intended to give you guys a lot of our data information, and we do want to set up some really robust and kind of broke out policy discussions so that you can give us good feedback that we can include as far as recommendations for the commission report.
As Curtis mentioned, Chair Medaffer stole some of our thunder.
Oh, so sorry.
So
well, it means we're all thinking alike.
We did complete our pilot on March 31st. We are in the process of collecting all the data, analyzing it, and assembling the report in conjunction with the California State Transportation Agency. Our goal is to have a report out and a June-July timeframe. That is subject to, obviously, a lot of review that needs to be done over this next few months. Concurrently, we'll be working on our FAST Act work, so we'll delve into that a little bit later in the agenda. We have some presentations today that'll give you some idea of what happened in our closeout process, some of the survey results that'll give you a snapshot of how the pilot went.
Any questions from staff? All right, let's move to item 7. I know Ann is not here, so I think, Curtis, are you going to report for us?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I will report for Ann. She gives her apologies for not being able to be present today. So the road charge work group met via telephone conference. We had a great, about 45-minute robust conversation on a bunch of these issues, going through some of the slides for the presentation and getting some feedback from the work group. The work group in particular was interested in, and I think as Mr. Mercantornio has noted, a participation breakdown for all the groups identified in the TAC. We have gone back to a bunch of the presentations you'll see today and made sure that those are fairly robust. The work group also requested some more clarity on the results of the focus group sessions that CH2M conducted up and down the state. One of the work group members was a little concerned about the location of one of the focus groups being in Irvine. He thought that it was kind of outside the normal travel corridor and may not have represented the region as far as the opinions of the region. And I will let CH2M address that if you would like to ask that question of them. And then finally, the work group had, I think, a very compelling argument for requesting a breakdown of the participant satisfaction and looking specifically at electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and those other highly efficient vehicles as a breakout subgroup of participant satisfaction and, how the pilot went for them. Under the thought that this may be one of the early adopters that we head toward, they want to get a little bit more specific data on that particular group.
Okay. Any questions on that one? All right, let's move to item 8 on the agenda, and that's an update on the pilot operations and closeout. Turn it to Carrie, who will introduce Travis.
Thank you, Chair. Travis Dunn is here from D'Artagnan Consulting to give an update on the pilot operations as well as closeout. So I will just hand it off to Travis.
Welcome, Travis.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay, great. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We have closed out. Unfortunately, the data I have today goes through February. We didn't quite get the March data crunched in time for this presentation, but you'll see it next month. And frankly, you can kind of predict where things are going when you get to see July through February on a lot of these charts. So I'll quickly run through some of the operational results of the pilot with the reminder that we always like to give that no money was exchanged in this pilot. This was a mock exercise with regard to financial transactions. So first, a summary of miles reported by account manager going back to July, and you can see Azuga in green was one of the commercial account managers. IMS was the other commercial account manager in maroon. The CalSAM, the state account manager in blue, and you'll notice a couple of peaks in September and December because the CalSAM had the odometer charge reporting method where participants only paid and reported miles quarterly. So we expect to see another bump up in March for the CalSAM. And then E-Road, the heavy vehicle component, 55 vehicles reporting in red. Interestingly, 1% of the vehicles, about 7 or 8% of the miles driven. Revenue reported by month as well, broken down by account manager and a total. Again, this is mock net road charge revenue. And again, you see the peaks in September and December because of the CalSAM's quarterly reporting approach for the odometer charge reporting method. But overall, net revenue reported on average, looking at about $12,000 a month out of these 5,000 vehicles.
May I ask a question, please?
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, any member of the committee, just interrupt anytime you want, because I think it's important we have this as a good dialogue.
I feel like I should know the answer to this, but why is the E-Road revenue negative?
So this is net revenue. This is the charge per mile minus the fuel tax credit. And so whether you're break even, above or below, depends on the fuel economy of your vehicle relative to the statewide average that was used to compute that revenue neutral road charge rate. So it turns out that on average, the 55 participants under E-Road were slightly below average on fuel economy. So they got more back in fuel tax credits than they paid in road charges. Whereas for the other three light vehicle account managers, on average, the participating vehicles had a higher fuel economy than the statewide average. This breaks that down into those three components, so you can see gross road charge minus the fuel tax credit, and then the resulting net revenue on the right-hand side across all four account managers for each of the first 8 months.
Another question, Travis. So on E-Road, again, do you have any thoughts about why it is that that particular set of folks trended in that direction compared to everybody else?
Randomness, perhaps, that would be my first thought. Another reason could, I mean, it's pretty close to zero. I mean, the amount above and below the line here resulted in a net that was slightly above across all of the participants in the pilot. So again, looking at the E-Road totals, the net negative amount was actually quite small. So it could be just a factor of randomness. There were only 55 heavy trucks. Another reason that it's on the opposite side of the horizontal axis from the light vehicles could be that possibly there was some self-selection and the participants in the pilot tended to have more fuel-efficient vehicles on average.
If I can also mention,
mostly heavy
E-Road was...
trucks, so wouldn't they're paying the highest in fuel costs, so it's entirely an artifact of the assumed value of the road charge for them. Right? I mean, they're just heavy vehicles, so they pay a lot of fuel tax, and if the road charge that they're credited with is a flat fee, the same as the other groups, they're obviously going to pay more than the other groups. Stop paying more, that is.
There was an issue with the rate that we set for the pilot for the heavy trucks. There were so many different classes, and maybe Carrie can add to this, but the rate we set was probably a little lower than we should have, but it was a pilot, and we didn't want to do 10. I don't know how many different rates we had, but.
And E-Road is a system specifically for commercial heavy vehicles, so that wasn't available to the rest of the public.
So additionally, the legislation did say, revenue, it didn't say revenue neutral, but it was a replacement for the gas tax. So looking at the heavy trucks, as Norma mentioned, there were a variety of different classifications. We had to just kind of even the playing field and set a number based on that even playing field.
And I would just add in here, the legislation didn't even use the word diesel at all. And I would once again commend the California Trucking Association for jumping in to participate and to at least allow this process to go forward, even if the rates weren't set exactly as they should have been.
Travis?
Can I just...
Mr. Kay?
Yeah, just on... what is this for? showing on net that there's a net revenue, even though that we weren't aiming for revenue. I guess I just put out an admonition for those who are writing up the reports that that there should be an explanation of the net revenues, that why they're net revenues, so it doesn't become a piece of evidence that people who believe this is a revenue-raising mechanism can use to undermine the overall goal of this. And so I would just flag that as a problem that needs to be addressed, even though it wasn't something that was intentional.
And there is an explanation, Travis, maybe you can kind of, the mix of vehicles that we had in here, if you can address that, please.
Right, so I think it's a point well taken. It's worth mentioning that in the report so that it's clear that the reason for this was not intentional. It was an artifact of the fact that on average, vehicles in the pilot were slightly higher fuel economy than the statewide average that was used to set the rate.
And in fact, that's a lesson that's learned, right? I mean, this is something that we've learned from this that can help policymakers when they set policy.
I'm on to slide 5, which is simply showing the number of vehicles enrolled in the pilot over the course of the 9 months. And we have 2 lines, one showing the total number enrolled and the number of compliant vehicles. We define compliance as initial compliance. So there were a lot of folks who went online, picked an account manager, maybe got a device, didn't bother to plug it in, ever. Sat on their desk or in their mailbox for a few months, and we finally said, after a lot of gentle persuading to plug it in, forget about it. Other folks who signed up, enrolled, and didn't bother to report their initial mileage or purchase a permit product for those on the CalSAM. So we worked throughout the course of the pilot to get these folks who had enrolled but not actually taken action to start reporting miles to do so. So we closed the gap a bit throughout the course of the pilot so that those trend lines are both shown here. And again, same information broken down by account managers. And these vertical axes are not drawn to 0, so the differences may look more dramatic than they actually were. Basically, Azuga had about 3,000 vehicles throughout the course of the pilot, IMS slightly over 1,000, CalSAM about 1,000, and E-Road 55 all along, all compliant the whole time. Thanks, Eric.
In the future, for providing this data, it may be helpful to show the percent of compliance so that they are comparable.
We have a slide on the summary of the heavy vehicle participation. We had 8 carriers with 55 trucks. They drove a large number of miles for, like I said earlier, from 1% of the vehicles, about 7 or 8% of the miles. So this is just a breakdown of some of those statistics by month and by vehicle on average. And in the summary pie chart, you can see the percentage of miles they drove that was, we call taxable or road chargeable in the state of California was about 84%. They drove about 1.5% of the miles driven were in-state but non-taxable, meaning that they were on private property or off-road, and then another almost 15% were driven out of state. This is the first time we're reporting on what we're calling simulated interoperability. On January 1st, participants with DriveSync by IMS using the location-based plug-in device method we started receiving invoices that included charges for miles driven in Oregon at 1.5 cents per mile, which is the rate used in the Origo pilot. No money collected in this either. It was a paper exercise. But for those participants who drove across state borders into Oregon, what we wanted to do was demonstrate the possibility of using a single account manager to collect road charges in more than one state. So the table simply shows a summary of the number of miles driven in Oregon by the vehicles on IMS. Relatively small number of miles relative to the total driven in the pilot, nonetheless a proof of concept of this notion. Also in January, we conducted account manager audits, and the purpose of this was to evaluate the ability to audit road charge account managers and establish a rudimentary process for doing so, and then define some potential improvements to the road charge system. And the results basically that the account managers were auditable. Basically what it involved was requesting more detailed data from the account managers on a sample basis, and then comparing the detailed data they provided to the data that they were reporting on a summary basis on a monthly to the account management oversight to make sure that in fact there were no discrepancies. So everyone passed with flying colors. There was an interview process, and some design recommendations came out of that activity as well. We've had a question in one of the past meetings about participants who dropped. So we looked pretty closely at the data to try and extract a little bit more information about exactly how many and why. We came up with 174 people who at one point during the pilot through the end of February left the program, which was about a 4% drop rate. Most of them didn't tell us why. Those who did, it was typically a personal reason. They moved. A few participants actually passed away. They sold a vehicle. They totaled a vehicle. That was about 30 of the 174. The second reason was folks that were, thought that it was too time-consuming. They didn't have time for this right now. They didn't want to deal with it. But the rest simply would call their account manager, withdraw from the program without giving a reason. Relatively small number out of the total over a 9-month period. Nonetheless, some useful information provided by those folks through the survey process as well as through their communications with the account managers' call centers. Another question that came up recently from the TAC was about fuel tax credits. There were two different methods of calculating fuel tax credits. One was if you had a plug-in device that could measure your actual fuel consumption. That information was used to calculate the amount of fuel that you consumed and the credit applied to your invoice. However, not all vehicles are capable of reporting data in a way that we can reliably measure fuel consumed. So for those vehicles, we use the EPA rating on city highway combined fuel economy, city highway combined MPG. That's the sticker that's in the window when you go buy a new car. We use that number to calculate the estimated fuel consumption. So there's two different methods. And a number of folks did have questions about their invoices, both to the account managers and to the general helpline about some discrepancies, or they thought they used more fuel or they thought they used less fuel. So obviously when you're using an estimated EPA rating, you're going to find folks whose actual driving is different from what the EPA rating is, higher or lower. So that's a shortcoming of that method. And it's something that should be considered in a future system. And Matthew Dorfman next month will get into a little bit more detail on some of the options for improving that through some modernization or reforms to the OBD2 standard that the Air Resources Board has recently put forth.
What proportion of the vehicles in the test actually reported their fuel economy versus the estimated ones?
So I don't know the exact number, but it's about 2/3 of the vehicles with the plug-in device are capable of reporting the actual fuel consumed. And then anyone with a manual method or a smartphone method where you're taking a photo of the odometer and even the telematics, obviously those methods all relied on EPA.
Is this a concern, how we measure credits? It sounds like it's a concern for the purposes of the pilot, but in actual implementation, if it replaces the gas tax, it is no longer a concern because, am I right or am I misunderstanding?
That's correct.
I would agree with you.
Unless there's a dual system for a transition period where you're collecting both.
And just to add another question to that on that same line, if we do transition at the pump, as Jim was talking about earlier, with some new technology, then the idea of private account managers is also not relevant anymore.
Yeah, they're bye-bye. Yeah, and again, the fuel tax credit doesn't apply if you've got a pay at the pump model that really works, and Carrie will talk about that later today. And by the way, I'm going to try to blow us through this meeting so we don't have to break for lunch, if that's all right. We might take a little break in between a couple items, but we'll talk about that. You pull up to the pump, the price changes. All of a sudden, if it's $3.50 a gallon with a fuel tax, you pull up, now you got the real price without any taxes. You pay the miles, you go.
Let's see, we're up to slide 12. This is basically similar information to an earlier slide. Number of vehicles participating by month. Fairly steady. The only notable change was during the open enrollment period when Azuga picked up about 100 new vehicles. But otherwise, fairly flat trends for most of the account managers. When folks signed up, picked their account manager, most of them stuck with it through the whole term of the pilot. There were some questions earlier this morning about the call centers, and Curtis, I think, mentioned that this slide, thanks for that lead in. So this slide shows the weekly call volumes, and it was important to break it down weekly so you could actually see the shape. Vast majority of the inquiries coming into the general call line. Now, this was not the account managers, this was just the general call line. All of those inquiries happened at the beginning. And then after most of the folks had enrolled by early August, the call center volumes dropped to a fairly steady state, and we didn't have more than 50 calls except for 1 week in early October through the rest of the pilot. Very low volumes. And most of the questions coming in were by email, and a lot of those questions were general questions about the pilot. Once people were set up, if they had a problem, they went to their account manager. If they were hitting the general call line, it was because of a policy question or a general question about how the pilot was going. The top topics, the top 4 topics, number 1 was a question about their account. So we had about 300 questions about their account. All of those questions were transferred immediately to the account manager. So a lot of folks came to the general call line, hey, I have a question about my bill or my invoice. Say, okay, you need to talk to your account manager. The second topic was general questions about the pilot. And the color coding here is actually kind of useful because each little sliver of each of these bars represents 1 month. And it's kind of a rainbow of colors in those middle 2. So we got pretty steady questions about my account, general questions throughout the term of the pilot. But on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, topics number 3 and 4 were very much enrollment related. So people needing help picking an account manager, that all happened in June and July, and then a little bit during open enrollment, and then people with activation code problems, with that 6-digit code that you had to type in. And frankly, most of the people who had trouble with the code did so before we reformed our method of generating those codes to take out zeros, O's, ones, and I's. Once we did that, there were a lot fewer questions.
It's safe to say that if we didn't have account managers, we wouldn't be having any of this interaction. All right, so we could speed these slides up.
Okay. All right. Moving now to this.
Nothing against account managers, but you know, I'm just trying to keep the cost down.
This actually does show the account manager call volumes. They saw similar trends as the general line. High call volumes in the first months, and then dropping down to a very low steady state for the remainder of the pilot. Same information sliced differently on this slide. This shows the number of inquiries by account manager by month, basically as a percentage of enrolled vehicles. So at the beginning you had anywhere from 30 to over 100% in the case of E-Road. And most of those E-Road interactions in June, July, August were installation. So there actually was a physical installation of the device, so that's why there's a spike there. But after August, you see the numbers drop pretty well below 10% for the rest of the pilot on a monthly basis. Finishing out with elements of the pilot closeout, most of this stuff has already happened now. We had a series of notifications to folks that it was time to close down, send your device back, close your account. There were different requirements depending on your reporting method. If you had a plug-in device, you needed to ship it back to your account manager. If you had a smartphone reporting method, we wanted to make sure that you sent that last picture of your odometer before March 31st. For folks using telematics, you needed to make sure that your account was active, your password was updated, so that that last data pull could occur in March. And then the manual methods all required folks to have a certified reading, either through a smartphone or through an official reading at a smog check referee location. Those who did successfully close out got a confirmation email and are eligible for a $50 reward. And that will go out in May. And on June 1st, the account managers will purge all of their data and certify that they did not retain any of the identifiable information from the pilot participants.
Can you elaborate on what will happen? What data is retained and by whom?
So the account managers will purge all of the data that they collected.
Wait, what?
But that's the data we think is valuable, at least for sharing in the academic community.
Yeah.
The account managers transmitted data to the state on a monthly basis. That data will not be purged.
But what is the level of granularity? Is that per account?
Yes.
Okay, so it's that the state now has all of the data minus personally identifiable information?
Carrie, why don't you respond on that?
That is correct. The state does have all the data. It's all anonymized and is pretty much stripped of all personal information. So we have that information.
Which is the whole purpose of having the account manager, because that way it wasn't government connecting to the public. There was a third party, and then the state, the government only gets the non-PI.
But it's still at its original level of granularity, just without that information, meaning it's not just like, oh, 200 people did this, that, and the other.
The data that's reported monthly to the state that was allowed to be collected by SB 1077 was defined by the statute. And it's location, I'm sorry, it's not location, it's mileage by month by participant.
Okay, so
It's very clear in the statute as to what was in there. And I just read it the other day after we chatted, which made me think that there would be data of value. Now, if you were looking for time and place for a vehicle, that may have been taken out. I don't recall.
What about demographics, though, by race, population?
We have that as well in an anonymized format.
Jim, stop me if this is not the right time to have this conversation.
I think what we should do on the issue for the academic research purposes, as we referred it to Christina at CTC, and have her and Carrie get back to you guys, and I think both you and Terry should probably plan a conference call with them so you could have a better understanding.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, clearly, the whole effort was staying compliant with what the statute authorized. And there was a lot of sensitivity of the legislature to protect the public from any personally identifiable information. And very early on in the pilot, we were very clear this task force was to protect all PII for the public. And again, I think that's one of the things that, in order for any confidence in this program to ever work, folks have to be assured that's the case. I totally get the benefit. It's not just the academics. It's Caltrans. It's others that could definitely benefit from a lot of this movement data, because it helps plan what kind of road infrastructure we need to be responding to as well. Travis?
This is my last slide. It's just a timeline of closeout activities. There's only two benchmarks or milestones left. One is the mailing date of the reward checks, and the second one is the data purge. Everything else has already occurred. The closeout of the account deadlines, the notifications for that, and the deadline to postmark devices for those who had plug-in devices was Monday. So the websites will close as well on April 1st, the account manager websites, and that will conclude the account manager participation in the pilot.
Okay. Supervisor?
Yes, can you go back to slide 7, please? I have a question regarding the heavy vehicles. The gray area of 14.6%, is that out of state? And then is it in-state off-road and private roads, or out-of-state off-road and private roads? I'm confused as to what.
Yeah, I apologize. It looks like the legend got kind of pushed off to the side in the text a little bit. So the gray area is out-of-state miles. And then that little green sliver is in-state off-road.
Okay, got it. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, and the heavy vehicle was interesting. I think, Curtis, you said it was 1% of the pilot and 10% of the miles, which was...
Yeah, and Travis did a great job of correcting. He said 1% or 1% of the participants and 8% of the miles. So
8%.
Right on target, yeah.
Which, again, I echo what Steve Finnegan said earlier regarding Eric, you and the California Trucking Association being part of this pilot, which we appreciate. Travis, thank you very much. Any further questions for Travis on this item? Hearing none, then let's go to Brady and let's talk about the independent evaluator. And taking all that we just heard and see, is it really going to check out? So with that, let's turn it to Brady.
Thank you, Chair Medaffer. Before we get started, I wanted to get back to Vice Chair Finnegan's question about the price-based excise tax. It will be increasing on July 1st, 2017 by 1.9 cents. So it's going from 9.8 cents this current fiscal year to 11.7 cents this next fiscal year.
Thank you, Brady.
So good morning, Chair Medaffer and committee members. Caltrans and CH2M continue to execute the evaluation plan in alignment with the overall project schedule. You'll notice that Mike Warren is not here presenting today. Mr. Warren, who was our previous project manager from CH2M, started a new career with Parsons Brinkerhoff, and we wish him well in this new endeavor. Lou Neudorf will be taking his place as project manager of the independent evaluation team and is already leading the evaluation report technical writing effort. He will be presenting to the committee at the May meeting. Today I have two members from the evaluation team here to provide a status update. Susan Martinovich is the National Highway and Bridge Director at CH2M. Prior to joining CH2M, Susan served as the Director of the Nevada Department of Transportation, where she worked for more than 28 years. In that role, she supervised the daily operations of the department. And I also have Sarah Labat. She's from EMC Research, and she was our public outreach lead as part of the team. Sarah has been involved in every aspect of survey research, including instrument and sample design, testing, fielding, and analysis, and is also very familiar with focus group moderation. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Susan, who's going to be presenting to you next.
Terrific.
Welcome, Susan and Sarah.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, and good morning. So we'll just kind of start going. This presentation picks up from where we were at the December presentation. So what of the activities that have been done as part of the independent evaluation? So just we did the data analysis and report workshop and started our end of pilot surveys. Those went from the end of January to the beginning of March. The focus groups were mentioned. Those occurred in mid-March. We've been undertaking the final pilot interviews. There were, and I'll talk previously, there were the pre-pilot, mid-pilot. Now we have the final pilot interviews and collected those. And then, as Carrie mentioned, working with her and her team regarding the final evaluation report that we'll move forward with in May. So what I'll talk about today is, again, the pilot survey, a little bit of the information there. The focus groups will really go over what we're seeing, what we're finding, a little bit on the mid-pilot interviews, and then subsequently the next steps. So the final pilot survey, as mentioned, was conducted pretty much all in February. There were some attitudinal and some experimental questions, and they were built on questions from earlier surveys, the pre and the mid-pilot surveys. 2,750 surveys were completed, and I'd like to note that of those, 3 were paper surveys. So people were given the opportunity that if they didn't want to do it electronically, they had the opportunity to do paper, and we had some takers in that regard. Generally, the pilot satisfaction results, and I'm just going to flip through these slides because you have copies of them, but we didn't see dramatic differences in satisfaction as a result of age or in gender or income or in region, that we saw pretty much a consistent satisfaction, and we're seeing that grow. Same with area and same with ethnicity. The road fairness issue, all the same results that we saw was that there's pretty much a growth in satisfaction, that generally people are satisfied by the different categories: age and gender, income, region, area, and ethnicity. And so kind of just in general, our survey findings were that there's very satisfied with the pilot program overall. They were very satisfied in those upper ranges with their account managers. The security of their information, it wasn't overwhelming, but it's over the 50% satisfaction as people are learning more about the program. And the data security they felt had higher satisfaction. The gray is more in that they just didn't know, and so probably just didn't answer those questions. And then
excuse me.
Yes.
Yeah, is there any correlation, do you think, between overall satisfaction and people looking at how much more or less they would have paid?
I think that the satisfaction is related to understanding it and then getting the bills back and understanding the payments of what they had. And I'm going to have Sarah Labat instead of guessing. She's with EMC Research.
Hi, I'll be quick. It's a good question. One of the things we're not showing today but will be in our report is that people thought they would be paying far more than what they report their invoices were. So there might be a degree of I'm paying less or paying less involved in their satisfaction rating, and we'll see in a couple slides that satisfaction rating did go up as they participated in the pilot over time. We heard similar things in the focus groups too, where they'd say, you know, it all kind of worked, so I didn't really worry about it, and I didn't have a problem. So I think there might be some degree of the payment as a piece of that, but it was also sort of related to them saying, I enrolled, I asked my questions at the beginning as we saw Travis show, and then everything just went. So I have no reason to be dissatisfied.
But did you ask how much they looked at those invoices? Because I thought I saw somewhere in this data that there are quite a number of people who didn't look at their invoices, and I can say for myself, I didn't look at any of my invoices except maybe once. Because I was more interested in how it works and the technology. And I looked at how many miles I drove. That was interesting, but I paid no attention to the dollar number.
Yeah, you are probably a pretty good representative of people in the pilot. We didn't ask sort of an in-depth, how much did you pay attention to your invoice? We did ask them if they looked at it. The focus groups I thought were very interesting on this topic because we would start talking about it and they'd say, yeah, I guess I got an invoice. It's not real money. I didn't really look at it. So I do think that there was, and as Travis pointed out at the beginning, you know, they're not actually paying. It's a simulation. The pilot participants were very aware of that. So then when you said, well, what did you think of the invoice? They go, well, I glanced at it, but since I'm not paying money.
I think that answers to extent Richard's question, which was their happiness wasn't because they were saving money, because they didn't look at how much money they were saving.
Right. We did ask them, how much do you think you'll pay? And then how much are your invoices? All self-reported separately from the data that we're getting back from the pilot on what they actually paid. And we found people thought they would pay something like $40 on average a month in road charge, and then they reported their own invoices were more like $14 or $15 a month. So they thought they were paying far less than they had thought they would pay. Sorry, complicated sentence.
Can I make an observation before we move on to the focus groups? I've said this before, and I dropped the ball on this. I'd like to work with you on your data presentation. And last fall, someone contacted me, and I just wasn't able to get back. But I do think that these charts are informative, but they don't yet conform to best data presentation practices. And I think it'll go a long way in conveying the value of this pilot if the presentation can be made clearer.
Yeah, we look forward to the opportunity on that. And just as a side note, I would think I was one of the 6 out-of-state drivers, and I did look at and because I was getting money back, because I drive a gas guzzler, because I believe you need to put money into the highway fund. So I'll move on. And so results to some of the key questions was participating in the pilot, has it changed driving behavior? And we saw it didn't. People, once they got it and understood it, they just did their normal course of business. Participating in the program did make them more aware, and I think that that's a great aspect, is that understanding how funding works for transportation is pretty critical in telling the story. Would they participate again or in another? Absolutely, which is great. So that shows that they were pretty favorable. And then the model should continue to be researched, and that was great, is that there's an openness to look at it and look at other ways to do business and collect revenue. So the key trends, which we think are pretty exciting, and as Sarah mentioned, is that satisfaction is growing from the pre-pilot where they're just learning, not really understanding, not really seeing and knowing what to expect. It was kind of hard to answer, are you satisfied with this? But then moving on, we saw the numbers starting to increase. So that's a positive in the positive direction. The fairness, we think, is also positive, that people are kind of understanding that it is possibly a more fair model than some of the other models. And so we're seeing a growth in that. And then this is really good because this is where a lot of some of the angst comes to be, is the security of personal information. And so I think that there's a satisfaction that they're feeling better about it, but still not overwhelmingly, but it's moving in the more positive direction. And then what also is telling are the don't knows. You can see they've really dropped, and again comes to the education and outreach through this committee, through the organizations. So good to see that there's less of the don't know. So really overall, the findings and trends are the participant satisfactions increased over the pilot duration. The participants responded positively to paying for road maintenance based on mileage, kind of tied to the fairness a little bit. And then most of the participants agreed that the exploration and the study should continue further. The focus groups, and we appreciate what Curtis said regarding what the working committee said, is that there were 5 focus groups, and one point, though, is that we did a recruitment survey to all the participants, and it was online. And so with the goal being that they were selected to assure demographics and reporting. And so, yes, Irvine was one, but we also found that their responses were very similar to the other regions' responses, so that there was some consistency in that. But however, we will get back and expand on the concerns expressed by the group.
Quick question. Why was there only one in Southern California?
I can address that one, Vice Chair Finnegan. We looked at the concentration of where participants were actually participating. And so these were the highest concentration centers where participants were actually participating. We covered the entire map of California. However, for focus groups, it may have been a disincentive to travel a very long distance to get to a focus group, and so we wanted to allow the highest amount of participation in each of the groups, and so it was based on concentration of where they were actually participating within the state.
And can you just let us know briefly how well the universe of focus group participants corresponded to the larger pool in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and income, please?
Yes, and this will be part of the final report, but we set some pretty strict criteria for recruiting to try to make sure we had a distribution by age, by gender, by ethnicity, by, in the areas where we could recruit more rural participants, we set a floor to do that as well, to make sure that we had some rural participation, particularly, in Fresno and in San Luis Obispo. We also had a diversity of vehicle and fuel types, all the light, non-commercial vehicles. So we had, we made sure we included smaller cars, larger cars, hybrid cars, as well as diversity in their reporting method. So for each of these 5 groups, and we'll have a full breakout of all the participants in terms of all of their characteristics, but we tried very hard to recruit diverse participants in all of these groups.
I appreciate that. I'm just wondering, how close did you get in terms of race, ethnicity, income, and gender?
We were... How close did we get? I want to be a little bit careful about talking about qualitative research.
Yeah, we'll note that as a parking lot item, and we'll get that breakdown to you, okay. Richard.
Yeah.
Good. So what they shared was that, first of all, they appreciated being part of the process. They think that transportation is underfunded in California, and they do support the road user charge as a way to generate funds. There were questions related to the collection and the use of the funds for transportation purposes. So is the money going where you say it's going to go? Information about the account managers and mileage reported needed to be clear and concise, so that goes to the open and transparency issue. And then there was some concern over the use of the data collected for insurance and traffic enforcement. Invoices were insightful, but they didn't review critically, as was discussed before. And then they said that they wouldn't, again reiterating, they wouldn't really change their driving behaviors with this with this tracking system and how it was done. So that was the focus group, and then we went through the mid-pilot interviews. And again, we did the pre-pilot, and so these are summary of the mid-pilot. This was with the project delivery team, with D'Artagnan and with Caltrans, and the questions were based on this committee's approved evaluation criteria, so cost, pilot, user, privacy, and communications. And the findings from our pilot delivery team, the results of that interview, was that the program continues to be remaining on budget and on schedule. There were no budget overruns expected. The roles have evolved over the process. You know, as we started, they were anticipated to be something, and generally they just sort of kind of evolved into being able to address what was happening as part of the program. So Caltrans went from planning to administration and quality, and D'Artagnan went from design to operations and data collection. Felt that the open enrollment was successful, and were at this time continuing to receive the monthly data. Other interviews included the interagency working group individuals, so you can see who the representatives were from that group. And findings from the conversations with that group was that all the agencies really do need to remain actively engaged in the pilot process. They want to stay engaged in future planning activities, that additional enforcement and compliance research was encouraged, and that's pretty interesting because that will affect, we think, the long-term funding and revenue if there is the compliance and the enforcement. The agency had no access to the data, and then they understand that the road user charge will continue to increase, and they look forward to the opportunities. And then the account managers themselves, we had the interviews with each of them, and their findings were, and this kind of reiterates what the previous was, is that the cost information for the live pilot really can't be captured using the simulated, the monies, because you do need the long-term information, such as what are the costs of enforcement, and what are you getting when you do really enforce it? What is the compliance? And unknown, we didn't know what we didn't know, just that there could be some other things out there that affect the administration of the program when you're using real money. The current staff for the pilot operations vary. The economies of scale can be achieved by, there's a word missing in there, all account managers. They felt that they can make it work once we get started going on it. The charge to DMV data for enforcement and enrollment, that should be linked. The privacy and personal data, they felt that it can remain secure. And then there were some inquiries about private road delineation in their studies, in their information and what they've gone through. So next steps, similar, is that combining the focus group findings, as Sarah said, will be more in-depth analysis on that. We'll compile the final pilot review interviews. As I mentioned, those occurred early this month, and those results will be put together. We'll complete the whole data analysis working with your team. And that there were also some commercial truck interviews, and those just occurred a couple weeks ago, is my understanding, and we'll be putting that data together. And then working with Caltrans on finishing the results of the program so that we have something to you in the time frame that you need it. So thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question regarding the commercial interviews. Is that for the participants in the pilot or a more broad focus group type of audience?
It was for the fleet managers themselves.
In the pilot?
Yes.
Okay.
One question I have with respect to the timeline, you've been able to survey people that were in the pilot. And again, this might be you, Carrie, along the lines of Nitty's and Terry's question. Will Caltrans or the commissions, I guess it'd be Caltrans, maintain the database of those who participated in the pilot? That's not being purged, I take it.
You mean their personally identifiable information or just in general? Yes,
their names, email address, et cetera. I get to the point that if we're going to be looking at another pilot in the future, or if we're going to be wanting to do something else, there's a group of folks that have certainly already gone through round one. They might be valuable for round two.
We're transitioning all of our pilot participants into our information, getting more information. I want more information about, just our general mailing list that we have, our interest list. So we will be maintaining that and contacting them through that general list.
Let me ask the question again, and maybe if you want to come back at another time with an answer. I do think we should, and if the legislation didn't allow it, then we can't do it. So that's the reason we need to get an answer, is if there can be a subset of names that are over here that at some point, if we're going to do another pilot, there's a group of people that, I mean, it's based on what you're saying, it sounds to me like you got a group of people that are very satisfied with what they've gone through. I'd hate like heck to lose that group of individuals if we or the legislature or what have you moves forward on additional pilots. Here's a built-in support group, if you will, a built-in cheerleading base for getting rid of the gas tax. So the question is, are we going to keep those people's names someplace somehow?
So just to respond to that, Chairman Affer, so I think it's very important that we probably take the question, revisit the legislation. I think it's absolutely important that for the purposes of future studies on road charge, for the purposes of the academic community that can utilize the data that's been gathered as part of this effort. However, we want to be mindful of the very basic concern that was raised when this whole initiative was started, which was the wrong entity or the unexpected group, entity, academic, government, or private sector having my information, whether anonymously or otherwise. So I would ask the chair to allow Carrie and the department and the commission to revisit the legislation, make sure that we're all still sort of working within the context of what we were permitted to do, and be able to share the information as appropriate.
Yeah, and I think Brady, you got this, I think, firsthand at your report in Los Angeles when Commissioner Lucy Dunn raised this issue as well. And so I'm reiterating what I've heard from one of my commission colleagues. And the commission, I think, feels very strongly that we got to figure out a way that we can build on this base. But I totally agree. So let's give you some time to come back. I think that we need to figure out ways that if that data is kept, if there's a way to protect it, because I think that's just an important piece. Any other questions or comments? Lisa, and then Professor.
Okay. I know there were some issues during the pilot program with regard to privacy and also data security, so I'm going to just pass this around. So at the transportation corridor agencies, i.e. the toll roads, we utilize a methodology to secure the data called tokenization. And it provides a method for protecting sensitive data by using an encrypted artificial number, i.e. a token, to replace the sensitive data. Most commonly used for credit card data, but it can be used for other types of personal data as well. And only the merchant processor knows the credit card that goes with the token. There's a unique combination of the number. And the TCA agency and the connection have information, but not the encrypted information, and that information that's encrypted actually goes to the bank. So the token, it's useless outside of the actual system that it works within, and if we want to utilize something like tokenization to protect the privacy features that we need to protect, and also for the data security methods, this might be something we might want to incorporate to give people that higher level of feeling that their data, their personal information is truly secure and not floating around out there in cyberspace. In order for the transportation corridor agencies to utilize this methodology, we did have to modify our toll system because we had a different methodology in place. And so when we went to tokenization, we actually had to modify our toll system to work with the merchant processor to implement the different pieces on both ends. So I just want to provide this information for future consideration. Thank you.
I'd also like to add a little bit of information on that. Visa and Honda have been working together on that exact issue. Member Bartlett, and they actually did the first proof of concept demonstration where they were able to wirelessly communicate that information using tokenization to a pump. It was at the Consumer Electronics Show this year in 2017, and I can circulate a link of that information to the committee after the meeting.
That would be great. Thank you.
Professor?
We can't hide the fact that the participant community was not typical of the California driving community. It was more male by a substantial amount than 50-50, which is the breakdown statewide by gender. It was more, 2/3 were above the median income. A large proportion were driving Priuses and other very fuel-efficient vehicles. So we infer from that they were motivated to participate in this because of their environmental or whatever, purposes. So I would like to ask if the analysis can kind of head off criticism that this was an atypical population, and perhaps by weighting statistically appropriately, if the sampling allows it, perhaps by very careful cross-tabulations to bring out the rural, which is somewhat underrepresented, the low-income people who are somewhat underrepresented, women, to make sure that we're attentive to that fact that we want to report as fairly as we can, even though the sample, the group was not typical of the was biased in some ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wax, and you identify some issues that I have also identified as I came into this. I think there's a number of ways to do this. One of them is we had a very large participant pool, which makes even some of the smaller statistical samples significant. In addition to that, we can also, for instance, with the rural communities, look to some other studies. The Western Road User Charge is doing a specific rural study, so we can use that to bolster or confirm our findings as well. And we can make sure that those integrated pieces are in there.
And if I could just add to that, it would be really helpful to know in terms, if I'm understanding, Marty, what you mean by cross-tabulations. For instance, if low-income Latino women is not a sample that is of statistically significant size, to at least be able to identify those intersections.
All right. With that, thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right, we're going to move along quickly this time to item 10 on the agenda, which is the business case update. So we're going to get back to Brady and then Travis. Brady?
Thank you, Chairman Daffer. As part of the California Road Charge Pilot Program, the project delivery team has been developing a business case modeling tool. This tool is designed to provide comparative analysis on a wide range of transportation revenue policy scenarios, focusing on fuel excise taxes and road charge, and covering the period of 2015 through 2040, so a 25-year horizon. And today we have Travis Dunn from D'Artagnan Consulting here to provide an update on the business case.
Thank you, Brady. I'll start by describing what we have, and then I'll segue into what we don't have. What we have is a very flexible modeling tool that can be used to configure a very wide range of policy and economic scenarios for fuel taxation and road charging through about 2040. And you can configure, I can't remember the number, Brady, about 80 or 100 different policy variables, a couple of hundred technical variables. It's basically a build your own story type of tool where the assumptions obviously drive what comes out at the other side of the modeling tool. The purpose of building it flexibly is precisely because of things like happened earlier this month. The legislature passed a revenue package. Well, that changed all of the assumptions about fuel tax rates, indexing, other fees, and if road charge is to be in the mix, it's helpful to have the ability to quantitatively analyze how it performs relative to a moving target in the case of fuel taxes. So that's what we have. What we don't have is modeling results for the transportation revenue package because we were kind of trying to chase it down and it was very difficult to get reliable information in the time we needed to get it for this presentation. So what we ended up projecting in this particular result is what we interpreted was the revenue package at its current state sometime in late March when it was still being negotiated. So this is not
Can I interrupt
actually-
for just a second, Travis? Because this is really, no, that's not where I was going. It's fascinating, and I'm wondering if, in light of what you said, you can have this updated for May.
We certainly can update it. I personally can't present it to you in May, but we can certainly provide the information.
Oh, well, then forget it. Okay.
I'm sorry, what's your point, is not to have this presentation now until we have
No,
better numbers?
that's not what I said.
Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to say, I have to leave in a few minutes myself, but I just wanted to, in light of what he said, that that it seemed to be a work in progress, that it would be nice to see it fully fledged.
Well, and this is going to be a very important piece of what we talk about in May, and it'll probably be first up on the near the top of the agenda. So, yeah, maybe you give us the Reader's Digest version today. I don't want to cut this short, but to Lauren's point, with more data coming in, it's important that we have that, Steve.
And one comment I would have is I assume the blue line on here, and not to get into the details because it may not have been what actually happened, but I assume that's only the gas tax. And I think some thought needs to be given to the other revenue items in SB1 that are different than the gas tax, but will be going to roads and transportation. I think, previously registration fees and vehicle license fees were never included in all this discussion because the money didn't go to quote-unquote transportation. That's changing now, and it's a tougher variable to put in here on a VMT kind of basis, but I think some thought has to go into that.
Sure, thank you. Okay, this is a brief presentation, and really it's intended to give you a sense of what types of outputs we can create. And then this tool will hopefully live on, and Brady and I have been working on it for a couple of years actually, so he and his team can basically commandeer it and use it for just about any scenario that you might concoct. But just to give you a sense of the top level output, the blue line represents, Mr. Finnegan, what you just pointed out, which is that's just the fuel tax component of revenue. And it shows revenue per mile driven. That's the metric that we settled on as probably the most useful single metric when comparing fuel tax and road charge alternatives. So the dip in revenue after about 2010, that's related to the Board of Equalization's adjustment to the price-based excise tax component downward over those several years. And then the increase in 2017 was kind of where we landed when we were trying to figure out where the revenue package was going to go. And it shows a decline in the future because of improvements in fuel economy. At a high level, there's several long-term revenue alternatives, or many. The two that are obviously the focus of this program and this committee are comparing fuel taxes and road charge, and also bringing in potentially these new revenue tools that the legislature has included in the revenue package. So with regard to fuel taxes, indexing the fuel tax is an option. They've done that now. We'll have to capture that in the update to this. Also, just periodically increasing it as a matter of a one-off piece of legislation is an option. On the road charge side, transitioning to a road charge, it's important to think about how you transition. Does it happen very quickly? Do you bring the whole vehicle fleet in over a period of 1 to 2 years? Do you start slow just with new vehicles? Do you start even slower with just new vehicles above a certain miles per gallon, as Oregon has explored? There's a lot of different ways to mix and match vehicles and bringing them into the program. So the implication of that, there's a lot of different ways to model what could happen with future revenue. So looking at just the fuel tax scenario, pretending that the revenue package did not pass for a moment, looking back to where we were in 2015, if you imagine a fuel tax that's a flat per gallon tax with no indexing to inflation, no increases, the revenue per mile declines as fuel economy increases. So that's the red line on this chart, the lower line. If you index the fuel tax to whatever index, inflation, CPI, PPI, I can't remember what they chose in the revenue package, but if the index averages to about 1% per year, then you get that middle line. If it averages to 2.5% per year, you get the upper line, the green line.
And for the future also, we don't know what we know what the index is based on. We don't know how the numbers will play out over long term. Right. Could be higher than 2.5%, could be anything.
That's right. So that's why we want to show, we certainly have the ability in the model to play around with that variable and imagine where it could go under different assumptions. On the road charge side, this is a sort of a conceptual depiction of those different transition alternatives. The one on the upper left we call the Big Bang, bringing all the vehicles in over a very short period of time. So the blue trend line is the number of vehicles paying fuel tax. The red trend line is the number of vehicles paying road charge. So you kind of flip the switch and all of a sudden there's no fuel tax and everyone's on road charge. On the other hand, if you opt for a slower transition on the upper right with just new vehicles, it's a gradual transition of road charge paying vehicles into the system and a gradual transition of vehicles paying fuel tax out. So these are just 4 illustrations of, and they're conceptual, they're not actual numbers, they're just intended to illustrate what the transition looks like in terms of number of vehicles. What that means for revenue, in terms of road charge, again, we're taking that chart that just shows revenue per mile driven, which is the blue trend line on the right-hand side. And if you opt for a Big Bang, bring all the vehicles in at once, and I think we assumed that would happen in 2025, you see a slight decline in the early years, and then it flattens out as soon as you transition all the vehicles because you set the rate, it's flat, and it doesn't change over time.
To go from per mile to this chart with total revenue, you had to make some assumptions about how much driving would take place, how much VMT would be. And the price of fuel, of course, will change as a result of the taxation, and the use of fuel and the fuel economy of vehicles will change as a result of that as well. So how did you estimate VMT?
Well, the beauty of the metric of revenue per mile driven is we didn't have to do that. We assumed fuel economy.
Revenue per mile driven to total revenue.
Correct. Oh, I
you
see.
do, yeah.
Yes, to take that jump from revenue per mile to total revenue, we had to assume VMT growth. So the model gives you the ability to configure that as well. And the red line, in fact, on this slide 6, shows the VMT trend line assumption that's behind that. And that is highly configurable as well. So that allows us to not take any responsibility for assumptions about the future because you can change the assumptions and get a different outcome. This is a similar chart, but only showing a slower transition of just new vehicles. So you see the gasoline excise tax component declining more gradually. That's the red portion on the left, and the road charge component of revenue gradually increase, which is the blue component. And then third, this one's kind of interesting. And this one also is highly dependent on assumptions about what happens to the alternative fuel vehicle space. Under the EIA's assumptions about the introduction of electric vehicles, you only get about 1 to 2% of new vehicles sold by 2040 are all electric. So if you were to just, for example, start with electric vehicles, it doesn't do a whole lot for revenue because there aren't that many of them. If that turns out to be an incorrect assumption and there are a lot of electric vehicles, of course, then this chart changes. But under the current EIA assumptions, this is what it looks like. So my last slide is simply a comparative of that revenue per mile driven line. The first one is the transportation package as it was several weeks ago, not the actual one that passed. The second one shows what would happen with that package plus a 1% approximately annual index on fuel tax, then a 2.5% index, and then the red lines are all different scenarios of road charging, depending on how quickly you imagine a transition and what types of vehicles.
Can I, just for clarification, what is the charge per mile in the road charge assumed here?
I believe it's about 2.4 cents, which is higher than the 1.8 because we had to reset the revenue neutral level to match the new fuel tax rate. That's it. Any questions?
Any other questions? We will hear more, and you won't be here at our next meeting, but it's going to be Matthew over here. Okay.
Could I ask you a quick question, please?
Yeah.
Does your model allow the ability to see how many vehicles rather than just VMT are making up these portions? I would be interested in knowing over time, for example, what fraction of the revenue is paid by what fraction of the vehicles or drivers, if you will. I mean, basically, is the population that is supporting this revenue growing smaller and smaller? We believe it is, but I'd be interested in what those numbers look like.
Yes, it does.
Well, I just want to say for a minute how much we've appreciated all of your work.
Got two more.
Oh, you do? My apologies. Just trying to speed him along.
I'll go real fast this one.
I thought you just signaled to me you were done. It says thank you.
Gino has to load up the next one.
And as Gino loads this up, I want to preface these next two. They've got some policy questions in them, and as we stated, this is kind of informational, to get those questions flowing, and so that hopefully when you come back in May for our next meeting, you'll have some ideas about the answers to the questions that are posed in these next two sets of slides, and much beyond that for those policy conversations.
Want to take a bio break? Okay, that's probably not a bad idea. Let's take a 10-minute bio break. We'll reconvene at exactly 12:10.